Okay, looks like I'm live. So, how are you all doing today? I am doing okay. I had a couple of days off. Just needed to take a little bit of a break from streaming because there's a little bit of prep work to be involved, and I was just tired and all of that. And there's plenty to discuss today. I'm going to try to make this video very short. I'm not promising it will be. And for that, in advance, I do apologize. But I want to talk about Afghanistan today. That's what I'm going to be focusing on because there's a lot to be said about Afghanistan. After all, we've been there for almost 20 years. And, the thing about it is, I'm going to point out some major hypocrisy in as long as this video lasts. So be patient, and I hope that what I will have to say will be valued into the discourse about Afghanistan. As we all know, Afghanistan, in our very modern context, became relevant because of what happened on September the 11th, 2001, almost 20 years ago, with the invasion, with the 9/11 attacks on the United States. The Al Qaeda network orchestrating the attacks against United States with the terrorist attacks of course, we all know about the Twin Towers, the Pentagon. It almost hit the White House, but that particular flight, there was a struggle on there, and that plane landed somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, crashing, and the people, the passengers on that flight knew what was going on, and they were like, well, "We got nothing to lose," so they went and did some major kicking ass. And I think that the biggest heroes that day were the people on what was called Flight 93, I believe it was United Airlines. I think it was United Airlines Flight 93, where it went down in Pennsylvania. The passengers went and did a major act of kick ass, and they're probably the biggest heroes that day, on par with the 9/11 first responders on Ground Zero in New York. Well, 9/11 started the war on terror, and the really horrible aftermath of 9/11 in America was the domestic clampdown on civil liberties, um, and blaming 9/11 on wrong actors who are not necessarily angels by any stretch of the imagination, but were not responsible for it. Like, for example, Saddam Hussein, and was blamed for being politically in bed with Osama bin Laden. And if anybody knows anything about basic Middle East politics, that you know that that's just not the case. And so as I said, with the invasion of Iraq that took place 2 years later, in 2003, that was an example of blaming the wrong actors by invading the wrong country. Of course, when you think about it, when George W. Bush became president, Vice President Dick Cheney talked about the axis of evil, meaning that he had his eyes on North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. That's what he meant by axis of evil. Now, none of those three nations are, by any stretch of the imagination, wonderful as far as human rights are concerned, but is Dick Cheney any better wanting to do an invasion, considering what we know the long-term detrimental effects of invasions that's taken place in the last 2 decades? And of course, we can't forget torture that took place in Guantanamo Bay down in over there. Probably one of the worst aspects of the U.S. looking into its dark side. Well, there's a lot to be said when it comes to partisan politics. So what I'm going to do, Glenn Beck, a few days ago, and Glenn Beck this morning, as I was paying my internet bill, was talking about U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and play what he had to say, and I'll share some thoughts and more commentary afterwards. Give me a moment here, and we shall start momentarily.
Should we talk about Afghanistan? Talk about Afghanistan. It seems to be a mess today. And I would like to make sure that Joe Biden gets all of the credit for this. Now, I disagree with our mission, and I'll tell you what I think we should learn from it here in a minute. But remember, he said the Afghan army was fully trained and ready to just take over and keep the Taliban at bay. How much of Jason? How much of Afghanistan is now gone?
Oh, it's over 75% right now. That's pretty much the whole country.
So they're doing a really good job.
Bang up job.
Yeah, that Afghan army is really pushing back.
Yeah, I think it was somewhere around $80 billion we spent training that army.
Yeah, forget about the money. How that was just in training.
Yeah.
Forget about the money. How many lives were lost? How many lives were lost? This is an abomination. And can we please learn our lesson? This started over 100 years ago of let's do nation building. It doesn't work. We should have gone in and said, oh, I'm sorry, Taliban. You want to play this game? Okay. We're going to bomb the bat snot out of you. And we should have gone in and just bombed them, killed as many of them that were involved in 9/11 as possible, continued to go get Osama bin Laden. But when Osama bin Laden was had, that should have been it. And it should have been it in Afghanistan long before that. We don't need to nation build. It doesn't work.
Would this not have just happened?
Okay, give me a moment here, and you'll see my ugly mug momentarily. Give me a moment. Here I am. Okay, there's a lot to be said about that. One, I'm going to tell you about Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck speaks out of both sides of his mouth. He does a lot of doublespeak. Take it from somebody who's listened to conservative talk radio as much as I listen to the online left, pretty damn equally. And I'm able to formulate the opinions I have on this program. Glenn Beck, when all this shit was happening in 2001, all the way to sometime during the Obama presidency, he was the biggest supporter of the Bush-Cheney policy. He supported going into Iraq. He supported the clampdown on civil liberties with things like the Patriot Act. He supported torture down in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, he was just right down the line when it came to George W. Bush and Dick Cheney on their policy. Even during the Trump years, when Donald Trump appointed John Bolton as the national security advisor, he thought that was very wonderful because he just thought he's one of the top people that should be directing foreign policy. In other words, Glenn Beck is a neocon. Now, was he during the Obama years? Was he sincere when he said, "Liberals, you were correct and I was wrong on Iraq"? He did say that he regretted supporting the war in Iraq. And if Glenn Beck is sincere, then hey, we all make mistakes. We've all had positions that were once cringy in the past that we ended up looking back and thinking, well, gee, I was really wrong on this, and I am a grown up and an adult, and I can accept when I'm at fault about things. And if that's sincerity on his part, I have no problems. But you see, Glenn Beck is the kind of person. One day you listen to Glenn Beck, he wants to sound like a right-wing nut, and then the next day you listen to Glenn Beck, he sounds reasonable. He doesn't have any core conviction, and he's always checking which way his audience could go. And unfortunately, he kind of went back to his old ways after being a never Trumper in 2016. He lost a large chunk of his audience, so he had to go and do what he can to get back his audience. So anyway, so he's now blaming Biden because he wants to He's thinking that there's going to be a Republican comeback, and I am almost agreeing with what he thinks might happen. I don't want it to happen, but he's thinking there will be a clamoring for a return to the neoconservative policy of yesteryear, where being for the Bush Cheney policy was considered politically virtuous, and being critical of it was considered treason. And I'm afraid that that might come back, and I think he's sort of setting himself up to which side of the political fence he could be on. Just my opinion. But you see, when it comes to this whole thing with Iraq and all of that, the trillions that we spend on this war, there's going to be a bad aftermath of this, and I'm going to tell you, it's going to be a bad aftermath. Biden withdrawing from Afghanistan is the correct thing to do. And I am not a fan of Joe Biden. I criticize Joe Biden from his left, as I do any president from their left. And the thing about it is, I'm going to defend Joe Biden. If there's a withdrawal, the United States, the people of the United States should celebrate, because we spent 2 decades in Afghanistan and spend trillions of dollars. You want to know where most of this debt's coming from? It's not coming from things like stimulus checks to ordinary people and you know, whatever little minuscule responses that the U.S. government does for the American people, that some Republican types like Mitch McConnell thinking, oh, we're treating American working people together, giving them unemployment, making more, or they're not working than while they were working. I mean, you know, no, Mitch McConnell, that you're full of shit. Our debt is coming from being in the Middle East all these years. Tens of trillions of dollars shoved down the toilet, when that tens of trillions of dollars could have been spent on things like health care for Americans. Could have been spent on federal jobs guarantee to rebuild our nation's crumbling infrastructure. Could have been spent on free college and to start funding a Green New Deal. That's what we needed to spend on, not this bullshit war in the Middle East that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney fucked up just to appease secular neocons in Congress, to appease the military-industrial complex, and to appease evangelical Christians wanting to bring about Armageddon by promoting a war in the Middle East. So that's where it comes from. And I'm not being a partisan hack. Remember, during the Bill Clinton presidency, there was a no-fly zone set up by George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton kept the same policies George Herbert Walker Bush in the 1990s. Remember, Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State, and she actually increased sanctions against the people of Iraq and said, well, the million people that died, it was worth it. So you got that, and then you got the Mr. Hope and Change, Barack Obama. He came in there, and what did he do? He continued the policies of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Did it with rainbow flags. They're more sensitive, more tolerant on how they go about bombing the shit out of brown people in the Middle East. But you know, hey, they did it in a very, very pro-tolerance and liberal, progressive way. La-di-da-da. I don't think that people who are being bombed do not give a shit that there are socially progressive folks dropping the bombs down on them. And Mr. Trump, the man who was correct in the Republican primaries to call out on Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, all those other fuckers for supporting the Bush-Cheney doctrine. He got booed on stage, and he was correct then. There was a certain faction of that Trump base, not all of them, but there was a certain faction that voted for Trump because they figured that he could be a paleocon and not have the United States involved in the Middle East. That's what some of them were hoping. And just like a lot of dubs and liberals on the left who voted for Democrats for the same reason, they had the rug pulled from under them. Because once Trump came in there, he became the cuck of the military-industrial complex. He became the cuck of secular neocons that were loyal to the Mitt Romney, George W. Bush wing of the party. And he became a cuck for TV evangelists like John Hagee, who wanted the United States to withdraw from one of the best things Obama did while he was president. That was the peace deal with Iran to help them to limit their nuclear weapons. Don't even get me started on the drone bombing in Baghdad of General Qasem Soleimani of Iran. Now, he's no angel, but you know what? If you know anything about Middle Eastern politics, he was fighting the same fucking people that the Americans are supposedly are against. We're talking about ISIS, and we're talking about Al Qaeda. We're talking about all the crazy ones that are over there in the Middle East. And people in the United States, I'm afraid, are deeply, deeply ignorant on Middle Eastern politics in many areas. So if Joe Biden has a lot of his faults, withdrawing from Afghanistan isn't one of them. I say, good. Joe Biden, you finally done something that made someone like me who's skeptical of you on the left happy for a change. Thank you. I think it's going to be ultimately good for the American people that a major part of our foreign policy that has failed over the last two decades are coming to an end. I see only good for the United States as a result. Certainly not bad, but it goes back further. It goes back to Ronald Reagan and even to an extent Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter, I think in my 52 years of living, might have been the best president we've had. And he has a lot of faults, or had a lot of faults while he was president. Now, he used the bully pulpit of his ex-presidency to do good things, like build houses for the homeless and low-income people, to go and support peaceful measures around the world. He's a real humanitarian, a real good man, and he was probably the one president that did not become a cuck for the military-industrial complex in the way that every other president prior to Jimmy Carter and after Jimmy Carter were. And the thing about it is that because he was probably the most resistant to the ways of the military-industrial complex, it ended his presidency in one term. And let's not forget some of the good that Jimmy Carter's done when it comes to foreign policy while he was president. He brought Egypt and Israel together to sign a peace treaty to end their state of war against each other. And no matter where you stand on that issue, the fact that two countries who were at war with each other are no longer at war with each other, are getting along, at least diplomatically, should be a positive thing. So Jimmy Carter is very underrated and misunderstood. Now, Ronald Reagan, when he became president, with Jimmy Carter, yeah, he started to think about supporting the rebels in Afghanistan when the Soviets started to invade Afghanistan. And so he started to assist the rebels in Afghanistan. Reagan came in, he increased that exponentially to the point that the Soviets withdrew in 1989. And I have a lot to say about the Soviets being in Afghanistan and all of that in a moment. But with the withdrawal in 1989, United States withdrawal, United States also kind of withdrawal, and the Taliban took over the basically the communist government that existed in Afghanistan between 1989 and 1996, and that government toppled because the Taliban took over the country. So you have to remember that Osama bin Laden, who was Saudi Arabian, the logistics and the infrastructure of this Al Qaeda network was indirectly a response of the CIA. The CIA, and thankfully this channel is not monetized because this would get me demonetized. But the CIA basically had Osama bin Laden on the payrolls of the CIA. And the thing about it is that there is more of a link to 9/11 from Saudi Arabia than there could have ever been from Iraq. And I have jokingly made this comparison between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was nominally Muslim. He was basically like the Western Christian politician that goes to church on Sunday. And then for the rest of the week, regardless of whatever political party they're from, they go to church on Sunday because they want to be seen as good civic citizens. And then for the rest of the week, they live their lives, and and religion didn't play a big role in their lives. And that's the average politician, even the ones who virtue signal it. Just the way it is here in the United States. Osama bin Laden, on the other hand, was like the fanatical fundamentalist Christian that goes to church and here in the United States. Except I would say that the fundamentalist, because fundamentalist right-wing Christian here in the United States will be less likely to do the kind of damage that someone like Osama bin Laden would do, because I would say they're probably But anyway. I'm not being a cultural relativist because I kind of reject cultural relativism, but I'm making some comparisons. What the fundamentalist Christian right person does by 1,000, that would be Osama bin Laden. Obviously worse. Compare Osama bin Laden to Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is the non-religious, secular, moderate guy actor in that region at that time. So there is nothing even remotely relatable between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. And by Western standards, under Saddam Hussein, Christians were not persecuted over there. Women were treated by Western standards as equal to men. They weren't even required to wear burqas and hijabs and all that. I mean, they were allowed to go to medical school and to serve in various positions in society, roughly on par with the West. That was under Saddam Hussein. And that doesn't exist today because of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, a lot of people don't understand about Islam and its conflicting factions. Sunni and Shia don't see eye to eye. And their divisions are so large. There's a difference. Donald Trump didn't even know the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah while he was campaigning for presidency. Both organizations, bad news. But there are ideological differences between Hamas and Hezbollah. There is a ideological gulf in Middle Eastern politics between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Both nations, horrible governments. None of the governments I will ever want to see even remotely emulated here in the United States or anywhere in the West. There's a difference between the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad and the fundamentalist Islamic jihadists who are trying to topple him. And one could argue that as bad as Assad is, and he's also not a good actor, but you could argue that he might be the Middle Eastern Joseph Broz Tito in the sense that his government protects Christian minorities, Jewish minorities, and competing Muslim factions from fighting each other. So there's a lot to say. And so when I hear people like Glenn Beck a decade ago talking about a caliphate against the West, the fallacy is this. There's too much division within Middle Eastern politics, within Islam, for a successful Islamification to take place in the West. Again, I am not a cultural relativist. Some areas where some fellow progressives have it wrong, and I'm not a partisan hack. Some areas where progressives have it wrong in the West is their acceptance for limited Sharia law. Fuck that. You don't need Sharia law. One area I'm going to praise the Tea Party a decade ago, certain like state legislature in Oklahoma, for example, put up legislation to not allow Sharia law to even be taking place as a foothold in Oklahoma. Okay, a stop clock gets the right time twice a day. And if you're a true free-thinking liberal, you should reject even limited Sharia law. Basic common law here in the United States is good for all involved. It's good for all Americans, including Muslim Americans that lives here. The trappings of Western liberalism. I don't mean liberalism as in Democrats or the center left. I mean liberalism as in, broadly speaking, a free society. That is the best system for us here. We don't need to emulate anything. And for people uh, like the ACLU my politics is, I'm basically an old school ACLU type who thought that the Gary Falwells and the Pat Robertsons were terrible in the 80s and 90s. Here's the thing. If I'm going to think they're terrible, why the hell would I want limited recognition of Sharia law, which would be just as odious, if not worse, in some ways? So that's basically what I'm getting to. Now, let's talk about Afghanistan again with regard to the West. Afghanistan had a puppet communist government take over. I'm not sure it was in the 60s or in the 70s, prior to the invasion of the Soviets in 1979. Now, if you take a look at pictures, I want you all to do a Google search for photos of life in Afghanistan in the 1970s. Look for a college campus picture. You know what you're going to see? You're going to see teenage boys, teenage girls, early 20s boys, early 20s girls walking on campus dressed like people would dress here in the United States in the 1970s. You see very little differences. Maybe a little more olive complexion, darker hair, but other than that, it will look pretty much the same. And that was under their puppet communist government. I am not a Marxist-Leninist in any stretch of the imagination. Now, there are people to my right, not all conservatives, but some conservatives, and I'm used to this, thinking that I am the biggest communist person ever. They tell you, you're just a communist. You're for the kind of system they had in the Soviet Union and places like Venezuela. And I mean, they'll say things like this about me. And I am not a Leninist. I have never practiced Marxist-Leninism a day in my life by any fair metrics. In most Western nations and even many developing countries, I would be a milquetoast centrist. I would be a bland social democrat. But being a bland social democrat in the United States makes you far left, because that's the Overton window here in the United States. I'm not trying to make it about me, but I'm just trying to, it's in context of what I have to say here. Some things are worse than communism. And I say this as somebody who's skeptical and would not want a communist government. And I would say that a radical Islamic state governing would be far worse. And so my point is this. When the Soviets came into Afghanistan in 1979, it was basically out of the request of the government in Kabul that were loyal to the Soviet Union and said, hey, we need help. And the Soviets came in there to assist them. Now, with regard to communism versus the, what would take place afterwards in Afghanistan, believe it or not, there are Western-centric trappings in communist systems. We're talking about, when we're talking about the Soviet Union, we're talking about the Warsaw Pact nations, whether we're talking about Cuba, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or Yugoslavia under Field Marshal Tito, or even in Vietnam. Here are the differences. Whereas the Taliban basically were destroying religious shrines like Buddhist temples when they took over in the 1990s and prior to the 9/11 attack. They were destroying Buddhist temples, and they were persecuting Christians. They were persecuting anybody, even moderate Muslims who did not think the way they would think. You had, in a lot of communist countries, you had basically a civil society. Yeah. Works of literature, you can, just like the West, works of art, things of that nature. Yeah, politically repressive societies, they repress your free speech, they monitor your movements. It's a type of society I would not ever want here. But there were certain trappings that were very Western in these communist states. Vietnam, as were they technically the bad guys during the war? That took place when the French withdrew from French Indochina, when the Americans' entry into the war. Were they the bad guys? Objectively, and not being a communist, I would say yes. However, look what happened after when the Khmer Rouge took over in Cambodia. Khmer Rouge, which was also a communist organization, they murdered over 1 million people in genocide. They were very radical, they were very viciously more authoritarian than any other communist movement that's been around for a country of its size. The Vietnamese government and the Soviets, with their moral support, went into Cambodia, liberated the Cambodians from the vicious Khmer Rouge. So even in the context of, even from an objectively critical stance against communism, some communist societies and some communist movements are going to always be worse than others. And objectively, Vietnam was more benevolent in regard to the conflict in Cambodia. China, on the other hand, sided with the Khmer Rouge, and the United States, unfortunately, indirectly sided with the Khmer Rouge because they got their butt hurt from withdrawing from Vietnam. Yeah, so and the thing about it is, even with Venezuela, again, I have my criticisms of the way they govern, because it's not, if you want to call it socialism, it's not the socialism I would support. But the thing about Venezuela is that the United States has no business in getting involved with inside of Venezuelan politics. If anything, they're an oil-rich country. I would rather have the United States buy our oil from Venezuela than to buy it from Saudi Arabia, for example. We don't need Saudi Arabia at all. But the thing about it is, and let me finish this about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was technically a communist state, but they were probably the most benevolent of all of them, because Phil Marshal Tito basically moderated that model, and he did so much democratizing within Yugoslavia in the 1960s and 70s that it almost looked like a generic Western social democracy prior to his death. But after his death, Yugoslavia, the factions, the ethnic and religious factions, started to fight and became a clusterfuck for I guess the following 20 years afterwards. But now things are a little more stable. We have several smaller countries there that were once countries before the Federation of Yugoslavia was created and everything. But let me talk about hypocrisy that comes from the right. And this is not everybody from the right, but the way attitudes changes. And this applies to liberals too. I mean, I remember when liberals were against TPP during the Obama years, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they were right to be against Trans-Pacific Partnership. Donald Trump was also correct to be against Trans-Pacific Partnership. Once he became president, he made sure that Trans-Pacific Partnership was not going to be policy. Well, all of a sudden, all the liberals who were opposed to Trans-Pacific Partnership decided, well, Trans-Pacific Partnership might not be all that bad. And I have joked that Donald Trump would have been for Medicare for all, that it could have been that the squad would be like, well, if he's for Medicare for all, we don't want it. I'm afraid to ever find out what that would be. But thing about it is, Trump did campaign on what was called America First, and he was skeptical of military response across the world. And at that time when he was campaigning, he was, whether he meant it or not. Well, once Trump became president, there were occasional bombings in Syria, and even the MSNBC were praising Trump for this. But you have people like Dick Cheney, who was like, well, Trump is way too much of an isolationist. And the worst thing that Trump did while he was president on foreign policy was to end the treaty between the United States and Iran with regard to nuclear reduction, because that treaty was working, and because Donald Trump knew that treaty was an peace. He wanted to appease the neocons in the party, and he wanted to appease the evangelical Christians who wants the United States, who wants basically the Middle East to start getting involved with more war to usher in what they think is biblical prophecy. And and the thing about it is, with the murder of General Qasem Soleimani, again, we're talking about somebody who was critical and fought against ISIS. Iran and the United States actually share the same enemy, and those are the radical Islamic jihadis. And strangely enough, Iran, Syria, and Russia have done a lot of the dirty work that the United States didn't have to do. And that's partly why ISIS is no longer a problem. In a way, we should be thanking Russia, Syria, and Iran for taking care of that little ISIS problems that was out of control for many years. But anyway, and then let's talk about Cuba. The last months and a half or so, there was talk about Cuba. You talked about Marco Rubio and some mayors in some small towns in that state, talking about invasion of Cuba. Where is the American first? Let's not get involved. And I used to hear from many of these folks. They got tired of war, and it sounds very nice, but all of a sudden there's a clamoring for a return to neoconservative warmongering once again. Let's not return to that. I mean, but then again, if there's a partisan advantage to doing this, I think some of these people will return back to such policies. And so the thing about it is that the neocons are still around, and they're there to make sure that the one of the few good things Biden decided to do, they were going to go in and shit on him. And in many, many ways, Biden is a neocon. I mean, in many ways, he voted for the war in Iraq in 2002. And, but here's he is trying to correct something. And once he does something that's positive, you're going to have people going to go crap on him. Really? This is probably the most pro-Joe Biden video you'll ever see me do today. You probably will never see another Joe Biden video by myself where I'm even this close to praising him. But my God, when somebody does something that's correct, I'm going to give them credit for it. I mean, like during the Trump years, when Donald Trump fired John Bolton. For that day, Donald Trump was a rock star. Firing John Bolton was that bad. I mean, that's what I'm saying. And the thing about it is that whenever somebody does something positive, with Obama, it was the Iran peace deal. That was the best thing he ever did. I even say that maybe the one thing Bush did that was proactive in this war, that he found a way to moderate Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Whereas during the Obama years, Secretary of State Clinton decided that she was going to behave just like John Bolton and behave like Dick Cheney, and said and just encouraged the insurrection that was taking place in places like in Libya. And now Libya is a failed state, and slavery has returned. But the United States can do nothing but have a gain out of withdrawal from all these nations around the world. And I wish that when Republicans start listening to libertarians, they don't listen to them on economics. Don't listen to Rand Paul on economics. At least listen to him on foreign policy. That's where he's correct. But with the modern Republican Party, they don't want to listen to Rand Paul on foreign policy. They want to listen to him on things like national right to work, or gutting this particular department or that particular department, and supporting more free trade. They want to listen to him on that, but they don't want to listen to him on things like let's not be involved around the world. Let's get rid of the Patriot Act. Things that really do matter, and where I will find myself sympathetic to what he might have to say with regard to Rand Paul in regard to war and domestic civil liberties, that sort of thing. Anyway, if you like what you heard, press like and comment. If you disagree, well, that's fine. We can have a conversation. Feel free to share the content on this channel. As a First Amendment absolutist, it's my duty to inform you to create your own platform and utilize it because we're all the muckrakers of our time. Feel free also to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, so you're kept up to date with hard-hitting social democratic commentary by yours truly. I am American social democracy. Peace, and I do mean peace and class struggle, absolutely now.